This is a controversial subject, and I want to say real quick, too, that Marcus is a gentleman, but you might not like what he's going to say, but I want to hear it.
Well, thank you, Joe, for inviting me. I'm very pleased that you felt able to do so.
And most obvious thing to you that is false, that's not real, that they're trying to sell us with this narrative. That's what I want to know. I want to know which one in your mind is like, this one should be very obvious. This one should stick out. This is the one we should all look at as a trigger to know, hey, something's not right here.
My particular understanding of the Apollo moon landings is that they did not happen the way we were shown. Whether anybody has landed on the moon or not, I doubt very much, but we certainly see no evidence that it's happened. Now, why could this be? Because obviously we've all seen it on television, haven't we? I watched it live. I'm old enough to have watched it live on television when it happened, when the launch took place on July 16th, 1969. I was up at 3:30 in the morning, it was in London, and I watched all that taking place, and then 4 days later they landed on the moon. We saw that live on television, didn't we? Live. It must be true. They wouldn't lie to us, would they? And then I started investigating it. About 25 years after the event, I actually heard somebody give a talk. It was about megalithic architecture, I think it was, or something. He showed lots of photographs, and he said, as an aside, he said, of course, you've probably seen those photographs of the moon landings. Well, they're not real. You know that, don't you? Now, this was about 1990, and I thought, what is he talking about? Of course they're real. I saw it happen. But I was trained as a photographer in London back in the 60s, and I was familiar with the equipment that was used to take the photographs, the Hasselblad cameras, very, very good cameras. So at that time, 1990, it wasn't really possible to look on the internet and check it out there. I had to go out to an astronomy show in London and buy a set of postcards, which I did, so I could look at them. There were photographs in books as well. And when I looked at these photographs, I was becoming increasingly aware that there were some anomalies, some inconsistencies with what we were being told, not least of which were the photographs were extremely good. Now, obviously, if you're an Apollo astronaut, you have the right stuff, so you can do things like take good photographs wearing armored gauntlets in your spacesuit and having no viewfinder on the camera. Of course, that's a bit of a drawback, but they got round that because all the photographs are very well framed, very well focused, which you had to control manually with your armored gauntlets. And you had to set the aperture and the shutter rings manually with your armored gauntlets. And you couldn't see the shutter button from it. These are all things I discovered by examining the evidence for these photographs. And the more I examined them and the more I found the evidence and compared the results as shown by NASA, which, by the way, stands for Never a Straight Answer, or the National Aeronautics and Space Administration, or No Astronauts Sent Anywhere, or any of the other quite amusing ways to describe NASA, I thought they were lying, because what I was examining did not square with what I understood photographic film. Now, this is a key point to bear in mind. These were all taken with photographic film. They were not digital images. When they appear on the internet, they've been scanned and entered on the internet as digital images. But the original photographs were taken with film, photographic film. Some people may even remember taking photographs with photographic film. And you take the photographs and then you take the film out of the camera and you send it away to be developed, and you get your pictures back and you look at them and to put them in an album maybe. But these are not digital images. What was taken on the moon was taken using photographic film and manually operated cameras that had no viewfinder. That's a point to remember. I've examined many of the photographs taken on the lunar surface, probably most of them. Actually, there are 5,771 photographs taken on the lunar surface by the 12 Apollo astronauts in the 6 missions that actually landed on the moon. There were 9 missions altogether launched with that whacking great Saturn V rocket, 360 foot high, weighed nearly 3,000 tons, and 1 million people watched Apollo 11 launch on July the 16th, 1969. The launch was real. There's no doubt about that. I'm not questioning that. I'm not disputing that in any way. What I am disputing is what happened 2 minutes after that rocket launched, because then it disappeared from sight. And the only source of information we have from that point on, until we saw those big parachutes lowering the command module back into the Pacific, in the case of Apollo 11, 8 days later, in the case of Apollo 17, 12 days later, the only source of information we have is NASA. They're telling us what's happening, telling us from what's now called the Johnson Space Center, named after Lyndon Baines Johnson, the president who was most instrumental in making sure that the space program got off the ground and continued and eventually was allegedly successful. Now, if these photographs can be demonstrated to be not to have been taken on the moon, there's only one other place they could have been taken, and that's here on Earth. And we know that many, many photographs were taken here on Earth of the lunar landings. They were taken during the training and simulation exercises, which are being conducted quite openly right across America at various sites, Langley, Virginia being one, and we know who also operates out of Langley, Virginia, right across America, right through to Arizona, Flagstaff in Arizona. There was a life-size model, it's about a mile long, of the Sea of Tranquility. It was created by the U.S. Geological Survey by the simple expedient of taking a few sticks of dynamite and blasting a few craters into Cinder Lake, just outside Flagstaff, Arizona. You can go and see it today. It's still there. It's not in quite such good condition because people do off-road driving across it. And then right across into Seattle at Boeing, where they made the lunar rover, down to Lockheed in California, across to Connecticut, where the spacesuits were being made. So this was all happening right across America. There's nothing secret about any of it. And before anybody phones in and says, oh, you can't keep 400,000 people, they can't keep a secret, let's just address that one right from the start. Yes, 400,000 people were involved in the Apollo program at the height of it in 1966. 400,000 people were the numbers who were working for the various contractors who were employed by NASA to manufacture their rockets, their landers, their control centers, their spacesuits, all the various pieces of equipment that would be required to land a man on the moon. There's no dispute about that. Now, these 400,000 people also would include people like drivers and secretaries and security guards and cafeteria staff. They weren't all rocket scientists. There were a few rocket scientists amongst them, obviously, because this was a fairly complex operation. And at that time, in the early 1960s, they were using slide rules. They weren't using computers. They weren't using computer-aided design. That didn't exist. Computers were really quite primitive at that time. So they were using slide rules. And if you're skilled at using a slide rule, you can actually do very, very fast and very accurate calculations. And obviously they were. They understood what was required. So these 400,000 people were doing the very best job they could to achieve the goal set by President John Kennedy in his famous announcement in May 1961 to land a man on the moon before the decade is out and return him safely to the Earth. When he made that announcement on May the 25th, 1961, John Kennedy had only been president for about 4 months. He was elected in 1960, inaugurated in January 1961. He'd already had to deal with the Bay of Pigs fiasco, the very surprising announcement of Yuri Gagarin's first orbit of the Earth in April 1961. And obviously John Kennedy had to come up with something pretty spectacular to demonstrate that America were not frightened by this show of strength by the Soviet Union, as they were called then, that America would meet the challenge and exceed it and demonstrate to the world the technological superiority of America. Fair enough. That's a political decision, and it's something which was obviously going to happen. But at the time he made the announcement, America's total experience in space lasted precisely 15 minutes. And that was Alan Shepard going up and coming straight back down again. So America didn't have a great deal of knowledge of space travel. And many of their rocket launches were rather spectacular failures. The Vanguard rocket exploded on the launch pad, which wasn't very fortunate, seeing as it was broadcast live. Russia seemed to have the edge. So John Kennedy's announcement, using the expertise of his vice president, Lyndon Johnson at the time, was to get America up into space, demonstrably able to show the world how good America was. That's a perfectly legitimate and quite sensible suggestion, which is what he did. From May 1961 until July 1969, when America allegedly landed Apollo 11 on the lunar surface, is just over 7 years. And as a point of comparison, in December 2014, the Orion spacecraft, that's Apollo 2.0, was launched on its one and only launch to date, December 2014. We're coming up to nearly 5 years since it was first launched, and it didn't even go to the moon. It just went 3,500 miles out and came straight back again. Hasn't flown since, primarily because the heat shield of the Orion craft very nearly failed. Anyway, we'll come back to Orion later. So to get back to the 400,000 people who worked on Apollo, yes, they did, but they were compartmentalized. They knew enough to do their own job. This is a military term, compartmentalization, and it was applied to Apollo because it was basically a military operation. It was controlled by the US Air Force. They were in charge in many cases because they were used to flying things. So reasonably enough, they would be the people who would take over and put it into effect, which they did. So compartmentalization means that you're working away on your spacesuit, let's say. You have no need to know what's happening 2,000 miles 2,000 miles west in Seattle, where Boeing are building the first and second stages of the Saturn V rocket. And the guys at Boeing have absolutely no need to know what's happening down in California, where Lockheed are building the landers and the command modules. They have no need to know about that. It's not part of their job. So they're getting on with what they're doing. They don't need to know any more than their job requires them. So 400,000 people worked for Apollo. They were not aware of anything other than what they were doing. They only saw what happened the same way everybody else saw on television. When the rockets took off and we all watched the live broadcast from the moon. Oh, come on, live broadcast from the moon in 1969? Get a grip. That does not happen. It cannot happen. Any broadcast company can tell you the power required to broadcast a TV signal. It's about 30,000 kilowatts, and it will carry about 50 or 60 miles at most.
What you're saying is this whole thing was designed, number one, to prove to the rest of the world that the American, I guess, technological, maybe even the industrial military complex, it was all about putting an image to the rest of the countries that, we're going to be the first ones there, right? That's what it was about.
That's right. And you summed it up very well, actually. That's a very accurate summary of what it was about. That may not have been the original decision. The original decision was probably what John Kennedy said, we'll land a man on the moon before the decade is out and all that. Once they started trying to work out how to do it, they found it was actually a great deal harder than they had thought because of one particular problem that has yet to be overcome, and that's radiation. Because space is full of it. After James Van Allen, after whom those famous belts are named, of Iowa University, sent up a Geiger counter on top of Explorer 4 and discovered the strength of radiation in space, basically they said, hey, space is radioactive. Now, at that time, obviously, radioactivity was a topic of conversation. People were familiar with the Hiroshima and Nagasaki bombs which had gone off and the damage they had done and the effects they had had, and all the tests that were being carried out in Nevada, the downwinders, remember those, people who were deliberately exposed to radiation without their knowledge? President Clinton eventually agreed that it had happened and apologized for it, but by that time a lot of people had died. So we knew that radiation was a problem. So that had to be overcome. Has it been overcome? No. A few years ago, one of the deputy assistant directors of NASA said, radiation is one of the two major problems of human space travel. We cannot allow astronauts to be exposed to the levels of radiation we know exist in space. It is too much for them to handle. So if that's been discovered now, how come 24 astronauts managed to go on the Apollo craft all the way to the moon and back? It doesn't make any sense. But the point is that from where the camera was mounted on the chest of the astronaut and his head was inside the helmet of the spacesuit, because you can't wear half a spacesuit, you've got to wear the whole thing, helmet, gloves, boots, the lot. Otherwise you'll explode. You can't see them from inside a spacesuit, and that is the problem. Aside from the fact you can't see the shutter button, which is on the front of the Hasselblad camera, and you can't see the indicator dial on the side of the Hasselblad camera, which tells you if you've taken a photograph, because you don't know if you've taken a photograph, because you can't hear the click, which is the mirror moving out of the way. So with all these limitations of use, I claim that the photographs that we see allegedly taken on the lunar surface could not have been taken by the named astronauts. They were taken by probably professional photographers here on Earth.
Eric Markham wants to know in the Fringe FM chat if you're familiar with photographic techniques like zone focusing and using presets for exposure control.
Yes, I'm familiar with it. Zone focusing, that can be accomplished by setting the focus ring to a particular point, so it is focusing over specific distances. I'm familiar with the speed graphic cameras and the square grid that they had through which the operator would look to frame his photograph. The point about the Hasselblad cameras is that they didn't have any of that. The focusing ring on a Hasselblad camera is on the lens. The lens is a very, very good lens. It has very, very high resolution. It was made by Zeiss in East Germany. The focusing is done with little paddles which Hasselblad attached to the focus aperture and shutter speed ring so that they could be operated with armored gauntlets. If somebody thinks that I say something which is incorrect or wrong or factually inaccurate, please let me know. I want to know, because I don't want to continue to believe something which is not correct. And maybe I will make statements which people don't agree with, and maybe I will make statements which people think are completely ridiculous. Fine. Tell me. Don't attack me for saying them. Attack what I say. There's a difference between an ad hominem attack, I attack on the person, and attack on the information.
Okay, so one of the biggest things is the camera situation, right? And so Eric is stating that there was no reflex mirror to get out of the way. It wasn't a single lens reflex camera. Now you can respond to that and then the best you can. And then if we don't get any more information, then I guess we'll just leave that there. So what's your thoughts on that?
Okay. The Hasselblad camera is made by Victor Hasselblad of Sweden. The Hasselblad camera is still made today. You can go into a shop and buy one. It'll look very much like the lunar cameras. It's basically a square box with on one side of it the lens which fits on. You can change the lens from a 60mm lens to 80mm, 150, 250 or 500mm lens. So you can change the lens. You can also change the magazine, which is on the back of the camera, and it is a single lens reflex. And that means very simply that it has a single lens. There is only one lump of glass on the front of the camera. A twin lens reflex will have two lenses, one that you look through and one that the light goes into to record on the film. I am talking about a film camera here, don't forget. So the Hasselblad camera is a single lens reflex camera. And you look through the viewfinder, if you're using it here on Earth, you look through the viewfinder, which is on top of the camera. And you look down into the viewfinder, and the light coming in through the lens is reflected up into the viewfinder by the mirror. That's why the mirror is there, it's to reflect the light. Once you press the shutter button to expose the film, the mirror has to move out of the way of the path of the light. And that is normally the click that you hear when you're using a Canon or a Nikon or any single lens reflex camera will have a mirror in it. The Hasselblad is a medium format camera. It's 70mm film, not 35mm film or 36mm film. It's the size. It's the same size of film as is used in the IMAX cameras now. 70mm across the top. It's a square piece of film, and that moves through the magazine at the back of the camera. So yes, there is a mirror in a normal Hasselblad camera. On the lunar Hasselblad cameras, the mirror was taken out because the astronaut could not get his head down to look through the viewfinder. So it was useless. They took it away. There was no need to have it. Now there's a point that I think we should address right now about photographic film. Photographic film, which is what was used in these Hasselblad cameras and also in the Maurer 16mm film cameras, which were also carried on Apollo, they were using photographic film to record the activity of the astronauts, in this case on Apollo 11. It was filmed out of the lunar module window, and it was set to shoot at 1 frame per second the whole time the astronauts were on the lunar surface, which was 2 hours, 20 minutes, in the case of Apollo 11. Photographic film goes very brittle in a vacuum, and it becomes unusable. How do we know this? Right, there are 2 other spacecraft which used photographic film. One of them was the Hexagon spy satellite, the KH-9, was launched in 1970, carried through to 1986, launched several times. That used photographic film. The other one was the Lunar Orbiter, unmanned spacecraft sent to photograph potential landing sites for the Apollo missions. The Lunar Orbiter, 1966, 1967. There were 5 Lunar Orbiter missions. The Lunar Orbiter and the Hexagon used photographic film to take the pictures. The photographic film was housed in a container within the spacecraft, which had to be kept pressurized. The pressurization was between 1 pound per square inch and 1.5 pound per square inch, i.e. not a great deal of pressure. The equivalent, incidentally, of pressurization in the atmosphere at about 60,000 feet. If it had to be kept pressurized in these 2 spacecraft which flew in the vacuum of space, so we're talking about vacuum here, here on Earth, where we stand, we have about 14.8 pound per square inch of atmospheric pressure pressing down on us from all sides. The higher up in the atmosphere you go, the less atmosphere there is, so the less pressure there is. And if you get to the top of Mount Everest, which is just under 30,000 feet, the atmospheric pressure there is about 5 pound per square inch, i.e. not very much, which is why people going into low pressure atmospheres have to take their own oxygen with them. It's not that there isn't any oxygen in the atmosphere at that height, there is. It's the pressure is not great enough to force it into our lungs. And that is why we have to take additional oxygen if we want to survive. So you get up into space where the space station is now, or even on the moon where the vacuum on the moon is so great, it's about 3 or 4 times greater than where the space station is, because bits of the atmosphere sort of float off and there is a little bit of atmosphere. Not a great deal, but there is a little bit. On the moon, there is no atmosphere. There is extreme vacuum. If you put photographic film into an extreme vacuum, it becomes so brittle, it will probably break. Now, having discovered this, I only discovered this about a year ago, just over a year ago, when I attended a lecture in London given by the designer of the camera for the Hexagon spy satellite. It was a highly classified system until about, I think it was 2011, it was declassified. So the designer of the camera was particularly proud of his work, and quite rightly too. It was a remarkable piece of equipment because it took stereo photographs so that they could measure the height of rockets and the size of buildings and the size of ships, because these spy satellites were orbiting across Russia, photographing all the things that they could find to see if they were building lots and lots of rockets or lots and lots of bombers. It was the Cold War, don't forget, this time.
That from my understanding, when it comes to the equipment and the tools and instruments that NASA uses, and I've studied this a little bit, but I don't know the specifics, but I do know that they are very apt to modify things, you know, cameras, equipment, things, to modify them so that they can be used. Has anybody ever asked you that about the cameras and stuff, about the equipment, and said, look, it was modified. I know things weren't designed this way, but we modified them to work. What would you say to that?
Oh, yes. Well, certainly, as far as the cameras are concerned, they were modified. If you compare a lunar replica camera, which I've handled, I've seen them. Hasselblad UK have one, which they'll lend out to you if you ask them very nicely. I've seen these. I photographed it myself. I use it in some of my presentations. They were modified. Now, a Hasselblad camera has what's called leatherette covering on the outside of the camera. That was removed, and the camera was painted a sort of aluminium-covered coating, allegedly to reflect the heat. It didn't do that, but that's what we're told it did. It had the mirror taken out, as I've already said. It had what's called a reso plate inserted between the camera body and the camera magazine. So every photograph taken on the lunar surface has these little crosshairs on them, which are supposedly be able to use to determine distances, because determining distance on the moon is difficult. There are no frames of reference. Well, that's what it would appear to be if we look at the photographs. But most of the photographs taken on the lunar surface, allegedly on the lunar surface, have these little crosshairs on them. So there were modifications. The shutter button is where it normally is on a Hasselblad, on the front of the camera, but it was much bigger. It was about 1 inch square, obviously, so that if you're wearing armored gauntlets, which they were with their spacesuits, they could presumably feel around the front of the camera, find out where the shutter button was and press it. Obviously, they missed a few of them, so they had made a pistol grip, which mounted under the camera, and it, as the name implies, it was a pistol, like a pistol grip, where you pressed it, and that would then fire the shutter. But you couldn't see where the pistol grip was under the camera because it was hidden by the camera from your spacesuit. So how successful it was, I don't know, but the pictures obviously came out very, very well indeed. We've all seen them. They're very good pictures. No dispute about that at all. But were they taken on the lunar surface? I contend they were not.
When we're talking about radiation in the Van Allen belt, are you saying that a rocket can't pass that, or just specifically a human?
Now, this point about radiation, rockets can go through radiation. You can't actually see it. It's part of the electromagnetic spectrum, but it's not visible light, so you can't actually see it. It doesn't stop a rocket, because we know the rockets have gone beyond the Van Allen radiation belts. Some of them gone to the moon even, and some have gone to Mars. And anytime you want to fire a rocket away from Earth, you have to go through these Van Allen belts. They start at about 600 miles above the Earth's surface, and they extend out to about 20,000, 25,000 miles. It depends on the amount of radiation that is it's accumulated from the sun and from galactic cosmic rays, i.e. deep space. We call them belts because they are held in place by the Earth's magnetic field, which, as we all know, points north. If you take your compass, what that is following the lines of magnetism generated inside the Earth by the iron core of the Earth. These lines of magnetism move out from the Earth, from the North and South poles, and they form, in effect, big belts around the Earth. And those are what protect the Earth from the dangers of radiation, because humans are very delicate little creatures. We're not designed to operate in radiation environments.
The projection of the radiation of the sun, there's a name for it, and it shows it in graphs as the Van Allen belt is going around at that that energy going around it, or deflecting it, so to speak.
Yes. What it's deflecting is what's called the solar wind.
That's right.
And it's going in all directions. It's not just going towards Earth. Basically, the sun is like a giant light bulb, and it sends light out in all directions. It sends radiation out in all directions. And if it coming towards Earth, it is deflected by the Van Allen radiation belts. And that then flows around Earth and forms what's called a magnetotail, which extends out about 200,000 or 300,000 miles beyond Earth. And the moon sometimes moves into that. And that would be the time, if anybody wants to avoid the radiation, when the moon is moving into the Earth's magnetosphere. But the point is, you've got to get off Earth first. And in order to get off Earth, you have to pass through the Van Allen radiation belts. Somebody will say, no, you don't. You go through the North Pole and out the top. That's absolute rubbish. No, it's not rubbish to say that that's how you would avoid them, because you could. But you've got to launch your rocket out towards the North Pole in order to avoid the radiation belts. Now, in order to go through the North or the South Pole, the same thing would apply there. If you're going to launch a rocket to go through, over the North Pole, you have to set it on a certain trajectory to do so. It's quite possible to do that. And in fact, there are quite a few rockets which launch satellites, usually spy satellites, what's called a polar orbit. It goes from North Pole to South Pole. And as it orbits around the Earth, it can photograph the Earth as the Earth moves below it. And that's what the Hexagon spy satellite was doing. It was orbiting on a polar orbit and photographing Russia. But of course, we didn't tell them that we were photographing them, because they got rather upset. So it was all done in great secrecy. And the photographs were taken in a polar orbit. Now, the Apollo craft, all of them were launched from Cape Canaveral, Cape Kennedy in Florida. And they headed out towards Africa on what I refer to as an equatorial orbit. Now, some people will disagree that it's not an equatorial orbit because it doesn't follow the equator the whole way around. No, it doesn't. It moves up and down around the equator, because most Apollo astronauts have actually said this, that when they launch, the first thing they look out for when they are launched over Africa is what's called the Eye of Africa, which is a remarkable formation in Mauritania. It's about 20 kilometers across, 15, 20 miles across, and it looks like a human eye. It's various rings. Some people have identified it as a possible location for that legendary Atlantis that we hear about. If you're launched from Cape Canaveral and you fly out over Mauritania, you're not on a polar orbit. You can't be. You're on an equatorial orbit. And for Apollo, we're told, right, they launched from Cape Canaveral, they went out over Africa, across India, across the Pacific, South America, and back round again. And then after 2.5 orbits, they launched to the moon. Well, of course they launched to the moon from an equatorial orbit, because the moon is more or less straight ahead. Well, 3 days later, it'll be straight ahead on Apollo 11. If you fly out through a polar orbit, you're going to miss the moon, because changing direction in a rocket is not as simple as changing direction in a car. You can't just turn the steering wheel and go in a different direction. It's Newton's first law of motion. An object will be set in motion and remain in motion until acted upon by another force, i.e. a steering wheel. But rockets don't have steering wheels. So what you've got is this strange 50-year-old story of 24 astronauts flying through these Van Allen radiation belts with no apparent harm to them at all. In the 50-year intervening period, no other human has gone anywhere near these Van Allen radiation belts. NASA say it's a problem they have yet to solve. The Russians know it's a problem and haven't solved it. The Chinese, we don't know what's happening, but presumably they're working on it.
That was brought up earlier, that there's been pictures that were just released of Chinese craft took pictures of the moon's surface. Nobody put the pictures in there, but that's what they're saying. You don't believe that either, right?
The Chinese craft was an unmanned craft.
Okay.
And it's perfectly possible to land unmanned craft on the lunar surface. That I don't challenge that.
Gotcha.
The Russians did it. In fact, they were the first to land a soft landing on the moon in 1959. The Chinese have done it. The Americans have done it with the Surveyor craft, the Orbiter craft. These were all unmanned. This is the difference. Humans are very delicate little creatures. We need a lot of protection. It's been worked on around the world. People are working on solving this problem. And I imagine that Elon Musk and Jeff Bezos and Richard Branson are probably addressing the problem now. I saw the recent assembly of Jeff Bezos's Blue Origin craft. Very impressive. Elon Musk has done some remarkable work with his lunar lander. But is he going to put humans in it? Well, he says he is. But how's he going to ensure their protection? Because it would be let's just say it'd be rather bad publicity if he put humans in it, sent them to the moon, and they came back dead. Because that's what happens if you get exposed to extreme levels of radiation. There are many stories being put out by NASA right now, quite recently.
And it's like, how did Apollo astronauts get through the Van Allen belts? And what they're saying is that it's speed and trajectory. You're saying these things are propaganda. So they're saying that it's a common misapprehension that all radiation is some sort of magic death ray. They said it's not. What they're saying is type, dose, and duration of radiation make all the difference, and that we evolved on a radioactive planet, and sunlight is the type of radiation, so is nuclear radiation, and that kills, but it also can be stopped by our outer layer of our dead skin cells. But even our bones are weakly radioactive, and we've evolved to handle the gamma rays that they produce within our bodies just fine. And long before Apollo, NASA launched a fleet of probes to map and characterize the Van Allen belts, and they have a diagram here. The belts primarily consist of an inner band of energetic protons and an outer band of electrons, all trapped from the solar wind by the Earth's magnetic field. So for manned space travel, the primary concern is the inner belt, and the Apollo missions were planned as to pass through the inner belt on the night side of the Earth, when the radiation intensity is lower and at a relatively high inclination, so as to pass through the thinnest ear of the inner belt. And probe data indicated, and actual dosimeters worn by the Apollo crews confirmed, that the total exposure due to the Van Allen belt passage would be about the equivalent of a chest x-ray. In other words, they're saying it's nothing to worry about. And this is what you're saying has been handed out as propaganda. Is that what I'm hearing?
Yes, basically it's that. NASA is rewriting their story. It's basically in response to the considerably increased number of challenges to NASA. Well, how did you get through these Van Allen radiation belts? And this is their answer. We launched at night, so it was less, and we went up through the poles, and we skirted around the edge of the belt, so we didn't really affect it very much. It was like a couple of chest x-rays. If you look at the original press packs, these are publicly available, the Apollo press packs, which outlined in considerable detail everything that would happen on each mission. And I've read these press packs. I've looked at the information which is contained in them. These were written at the time of the launches, i.e. in the 1960s, 69 for Apollo 11, 72 for Apollo 17. These were written when they happened. That's what press pack was about, so that the press could get the information before the launch and they could report it. That was what it was all about. In those press packs, there are about 200 or 300 pages long, are diagrams showing how they were going to launch what they call TLI, translunar injection, i.e. they would launch towards the moon. They did it over the Pacific, which is nowhere near the North Pole, according to my geography. They didn't skirt around the belt, they went straight through them. NASA are now rewriting their records, which is basically a bit dishonest, rather than addressing the problem when other parts of NASA are saying we do have a major problem with radiation. It's a matter of who you believe. Do you believe what NASA said at the beginning of the Apollo missions, that we're going to go straight through the belts? Or do you believe what they're writing about now? We went through the pole. Well, technically that's not possible. You can't just change direction from the middle of an orbit. And anyway, if you did, you wouldn't get to the moon. If you launch out through the Earth's polar region, you're heading well away from the moon. If you launch over the Pacific, you just accelerate so that you can overcome Earth's gravity. You have to accelerate from 18,000 miles an hour, which is Earth orbit speed, to 25,000 miles an hour, which is leaving Earth's gravity. If you do that, you've got to basically fire off in the direction you want to go, because otherwise you're going to have to change direction. They seem to have missed out that bit. So this radiation question is still a major issue. Yes, humans are able to withstand levels of radiation. That's why we have melanin in our skins, which protect us from the ultraviolet rays. It's the ultraviolet which causes tanning. It's always interesting, I find, that the white race will tan, and the black race, which normally lives in more tropical climates, appear to be well tanned already. It's as if somebody got it wrong, because white-skinned people are susceptible to tanning, which is a form of radiation. You're quite right. Yes, our skin will deflect certain of the electromagnetic spectrum, but if we get too much of it, it'll cause us a major problem. It's called cancer. What we need to avoid is that. Now, I mentioned the Orion craft, launched in December 2014. One of the things it carried in it were radiation meters to measure levels of radiation. You think they'd know what the levels were by now. They'd sent 9 Apollo craft through these alleged radiation belts, or allegedly sent them through the belts. You'd think they'd know what the levels were. But on the Orion craft, they carried fairly sensitive radiation meters. And surprise, surprise, it was much higher than they thought. And the Orion craft only went 3,600 miles out from the Earth's surface, then came back again. It didn't even go through the outer belt.
So what we need to look at is the launch trajectory, the geography of the launches that don't make sense with the orbits that would be in order to get to the moon properly. We're not looking at that enough, is what you're saying. Here's another question that's come in on the text line as far as the moon's atmosphere. And he said, if Marcus is saying we never went to the moon, how can we prove the moon has no atmosphere? What are your thoughts?
Do NASA tell the truth about everything all the time? I rather doubt it, to be honest. Don't forget that NASA are part of the Department of Defense, which is charged with defense of the American people, the American homeland. That's fair enough. That's what it's there to do. NASA are part of that. Now, we've all seen pictures of the space shuttle. It no longer flies, regrettably, but it was quite an impressive piece of kit when it flew. Why is it the shape it was? It was a sort of stumpy glider. It had a cargo container, a cargo section in the middle, which was 60 foot long by 20 foot in diameter. Why was it that size? So it could launch spy satellites. That was its purpose. That was what it's designed for. It wasn't just to fly seven astronauts up to the space station, which hadn't been built when the shuttle started flying. It started flying in 1981. It was launched, it was up in space, and basically NASA didn't know if the tiles which would protect it, and obviously we know what happened with Columbia when its heat shield tiles were damaged, and it came back and it basically disintegrated. It was considered that some of the heat shield tiles may possibly have been dislodged. So how could they find out if they were dislodged and ensure that the astronauts would be safe enough to come back? What they did was something quite extraordinary. Obviously, there were spy satellites orbiting at that time, Hexagon being one of them. And what they did, they achieved an interception of the space shuttle by the spy satellite so it could photograph the Columbia space shuttle as it flew past. And that would determine if any of the heat shield tiles had been dislodged. It was an incredible achievement to do it, but it was done. The photographs taken by the Hexagon at that time, it was one of the later Hexagons which had digital equipment on board, that was transmitted back down to Earth, and they could get the photographs and examine them. which they did, and discovered that the heat shield tiles were still intact, so there wasn't a major problem, and Columbia came back quite safely. And it also demonstrated the ability to maneuver and time two orbiting spacecraft on different orbits. Hexagon was on a polar orbit, and the space shuttle was on basically an equatorial orbit, though it was maneuvered into a position where it could meet the hexagon to be photographed. This wasn't known about until probably a couple of years ago, that this had actually happened. So the technology to achieve orbit and maneuver in orbit was at that time fairly well known, but we're talking 1980s here. We're not talking 1960s, 1970s. There are differences.
That makes sense. So what I'm convinced about is the most that's convinced me so far is the TV signal. I mean, I've always thought about that too. You know, the cameras, and I believe there's quite a long explanation of that in the chat room that I really don't want to read right now, but, you know, showing everybody on television and thinking about the possibilities of that. I actually have studied that.
Now, many people will say, yeah, well, you've seen all those people on the moon jumping around, or it looks like they're in slow motion. You just film it a bit faster and transmit it at a slow motion speed, and it appears that they're on the moon. It's not as simple as that, because what this film, Make Believe Smoke and Mirrors, did, and it's now been subtitled, and there are various websites where you can see it. It's not on YouTube anymore. It's one of those things that have been censored, as of some of my talks.
But in all fairness, I would say that if you believe, Marcus, and this is just playing devil's advocate here, but if you believe that the launch was real, but the rockets were lost in some other orbit, what could they have actually done at that point to prove to us that they were there, other than television, other than radio? I mean, in my mind, there's nothing that they could have done that would have factually proved it.
No, that's that's one of the major problems. It's a question I get asked fairly frequently. Well, what will convince you that they did land on the moon? I say it's very simple. What will convince me is maybe the result of something like the X Prize, where Google putting up $30 million for somebody who could launch an unmanned craft to land on the moon, move 500 meters, and take high-definition photographs. And obviously NASA got wind of this and said, no, we've got an exclusion zone around Apollo 11. You can't come nearer than 2 kilometers. Well, that put that kibosh on that one. If somebody could produce high-definition, indisputable evidence in photographs or film of something that man has put on the moon, I would believe it. And I'll shut up, apologize, and go away. But no, that hasn't happened yet. Somebody at this point is now saying, oh, they've done it already. They did it in 2009 with the Lunar Reconnaissance Orbiter. They took photographs of all the landing sites of the Apollo craft. Yeah, I've seen those photographs too. I know what Photoshop can do. And that's what happened. They were Photoshopped images. But they're actually ridiculously stupid images, because the only way we know what we're looking at is because NASA, God bless them, have put whacking great arrows on the photograph saying Apollo 11 lander, or ALSEP, Apollo Lunar Surface Experimental Package. Or look, we got the wheel tracks of the rover. We've got the footprints of the astronauts. Oh, wow. Of course that's real, we'll say. No, it's not. It's Photoshopped. And you can tell it's Photoshopped because the footprints of the astronauts are as wide as the lander. What are they, giants or something? 20 foot wide? Ridiculous. Now, I expect most people will have looked on Google Maps and Googled their own house and looked at the car parked outside and said, oh, look, it's got a sunroof. I know which way it's pointing. Yeah, that's what Google Maps can show. And somebody at this point will say, oh, no, they're not taken from space, they're taken from aircraft just flying above it. No. If you look specifically for satellite photographs of Earth, you can see that amount of detail. It's called the GeoEye-1 satellite. And I have a photograph taken by the GeoEye-1 satellite, 640 kilometres above the Earth's surface, or 400 miles, which shows, in this case, the London Eye, which has little cabs on it, which you travel in and look at all the wonderful sights of London. And just off a little further away from the London Eye is a car park where all the people in the London Eye have parked their cars so they can go on it. And you can see the cars in the car park, and you can see the sunroof on the roof, and you can tell which way it's pointing. Cars are about a little bit smaller than the lunar landers. The average car is about 15 foot long. The lunar lander is about 15 foot wide if you include part of the legs. On the Lunar Reconnaissance Orbiter photograph showing these alleged landing sites, you see nothing of that detail. You see a few white pixels surrounded by a few black pixels, which is supposed to be the shadow. It's not even an extended shadow. It could be a rock, could be a bright image. It certainly doesn't convince me it's an Apollo landing craft. Get this, these were taken by the Lunar Reconnaissance Orbiter from 15 miles above the lunar surface, shooting through the vacuum of space, compared to the atmosphere and pollution in the Earth's atmosphere from 400 miles above the Earth. I don't buy it. I don't buy that these photographs show anything at all that man has had anything to do with, other than the photoshopping of the image. It's a ridiculous story. It's yet another diversionary tactic by people desperate to cling on to the sad story of the Apollo moon landings, the greatest achievement of the 20th century. And here am I, sitting over here as dawn is breaking in the UK, challenging one of the great achievements of American technology. Well, I'm sorry if it upsets people, but do you want the truth or do you want the Disneyfied version? I want the truth. If you're happy with Disney, fine, that's okay, not a problem. But you got to live with it.
I could understand why people would get angry if they just believe it down to their core, you know. I think this has to be about, at the end of the day, it has to be about facts, number one. When I say facts, another thing, too, that I would like to consider is where are we getting our facts from? What data and what source are we getting these from? And some things are just like logic. The video, the only stuff I've honestly, Marcus, that I've ever really looked at when it comes to the moon landings that I've considered where people will look at the live video feed and they'll start analyzing the shadows or how the astronauts are moving or the American flag. Have you looked at any of that stuff and said, well, there's something obviously wrong here as well, too? Or is that just people just trying to pick apart and it's not that important as the other things that you've mentioned?
I've watched interminable films discussing both sides of this particular situation. Was it real or was it faked? There are good arguments on both sides. The first person to write about this particular issue, the fabrication of Apollo, was a chap by the name of Bill Kaysing, who died in 2005. He wrote a book called We Never Went to the Moon. He self-published it because nobody would take it on, and this was 1976. And he laid out a case with some inaccuracies in it, let's put it that way, that Apollo never happened the way we were told. And one of the things he said, well, look, you can see in the photographs there are no stars in the sky, and there should be because the stars would appear, obviously, but they don't appear in the photographs, therefore they're fake. No, that's not correct. There are stars in the sky, obviously, we can see them even on Earth through the atmosphere, but they won't appear in a photograph because the photographic film, don't forget this is photographic film, not digital. Photographic film is not sufficiently sensitive to record the directly illuminated surface of the moon and the stars in the sky behind them. And that is a correct explanation. So they won't appear. The question then is, well, why didn't the astronauts just point their camera up at the stars, open the shutter for a little bit longer, and take a picture of the obviously beautiful canopy of stars above them? But they never did that. They photographed Earth. We've seen the famous Earthrise photographs. But there are no stars in any of the pictures. No, there won't be stars in any of the pictures. This is photographic film. It's not sensitive enough to record the two different levels of illumination. The other point he made was, look, the flag's flapping. Obviously somebody left the door open in the studio. No, that's ridiculous. Even NASA are not stupid enough to leave a door open. The flag was unfurled. It was allegedly carried to the moon, and it was a standard issue, Stars and Stripes. It was about 3 or 4 foot long. And in order that it would show as the American flag, which obviously it would be necessary to do, and quite rightly, being proud of it, they wanted to show the American flag. And on Apollo 11, there are several photographs of the American flag being stuck in the ground, and it has a metal tube at the top which holds it out so it doesn't just fall against the flagpole and look a bit stupid. It's out, but it was folded up, and a lot of the creases in the flag still there, and that's why it appears to be flapping. The only time the flag is actually moving is when an astronaut is touching it, twisting it to drive it into the ground, so the flag flaps backwards and forwards. It's not flapping because there's a wind, it's flapping because it's being moved. Now, do shadows go in strange angles? In some photographs, you can see that they appear to go in pretty weird angles. There's a photograph from Apollo 17, but the sun is obviously behind the astronaut because you can see his shadow cast forward, and it appears in the photograph. But about 4 or 5 feet to his right, or to the right of the shadow, is a rock. Just a little rock, about 6 inches long probably. And that shadow appears to be at right angles to the astronaut's shadow, which wouldn't happen if it was illuminated by the sun, which we're told is the only source of light on the moon. They would converge slightly towards each other because it's a single point from the photograph. It's only one source. We've got 2 eyes, so we see in stereo. We can see it in a slightly different way, and our brains interpret it for us. If we look at something and we say, oh, it's the shadow being cast by the sun, our brain will tell us, well, that shadow is more or less like looking at a railway line, and it goes off into the distance. We know that the railway line is parallel all the way as far as we can see, but it appears to come to a point, and that's what's called the vanishing point.
I think what I'm wondering is that if this is a classified secret run by just a small group of people, I don't know. I think it's hard to keep a secret that big. It just doesn't seem right to me. You know what I mean? Like, if this was all fake, if we have never put feet on the moon, somebody should have spilled something. With the way the internet is now and human nature, I mean, do you think humans can keep a secret like that?
It's no secret, but people don't necessarily want to believe it, so they don't accept it. Now, Stanley Kubrick, he's been mentioned many times as maybe having something to do with filming of Apollo. I personally don't think he was directly involved, because he was far too busy working on his masterpiece, 2001: A Space Odyssey, which he was shooting in England, what's now called Boreham Wood Studios, quite close to where he lived. He didn't like flying, he was terrified of flying, so he always worked in the UK, and he did that for about 30 years. There are various little strange coincidences which come up periodically. One of them is his last film, Eyes Wide Shut, because when Stanley Kubrick was working, he had basically total creative control over the film, all the way through to its release. And one of the things he specified for the release of Eyes Wide Shut was that its premiere should be held on July the 16th, 1999, which coincidentally is the 30th anniversary of the alleged launch of Apollo 11. Now, whether that has any bearing or not, or it's just coincidental,
I don't think so. He did a lot of that stuff in his movies.
He did. There's a website which I can highly recommend to anybody interested in following up on some of this, especially about Stanley Kubrick. This is a website called Aulis, AULIS.com. Aulis.com. It's been going for about 25 years, this website, and it deals with the Apollo fabrication. And there are articles on it from all over the world, from China, from Russia, from Australia, New Zealand, America, authors who have researched it and put together articles. And one of the articles is about Stanley Kubrick and the coincidences within his films. Primarily The Shining with Jack Nicholson, and some of the coincidences between 2001: A Space Odyssey, Eyes Wide Shut, because Stanley Kubrick was known to be a perfectionist as a filmmaker. And there are several scenes where you see let's say, a chair in one position, and then in the next scene where the same room and the same environment is being filmed, the chair is in a different position, but nobody has touched it. Nobody is seen to touch it. Now, Stanley Kubrick would not allow continuity errors like that unless he deliberately wanted them to occur. Why is something like that happening, where you see one object in an alcove and then in the next scene, where nobody's touched it, you see two objects in the same alcove? Things like that. Very difficult to explain it. Now, people have speculated quite often that Stanley Kubrick was using a very new at the time, this is late 1960s for the film 2001, he was using a technique called front screen projection, where he was filming in a studio, as I said, in Boreham Wood, which is north of London, and he was trying to film the Dawn of Man sequence at the beginning of his film 2001, where he shows the apes prancing about. Now, the apes are actors in suits, but the background scene is of Africa, because there aren't any apes in England. Well, not officially, except in zoos. These apes needed to be shown in an African setting. So Stanley Kubrick was using this new technique called front screen projection, where he could project the image he wanted to have for the background onto giant screens behind the live action going on in the foreground. And he was the pioneer of this technique. It was used quite extensively up until the time CGI and blue screen came in. But that particular technique, front screen projection, leaves an artifact where you can actually see the join where the screen ends and the live action begins. It's only obvious when you start to look for it. And a lot of people have discovered the same thing on many of the Apollo photographs, where the rather bland mountains in the background appear to have a join where the quite detailed foreground is shown, where the astronauts and the lander and the rover are rushing about. If these cameras, the Hasselblad cameras which took these photographs allegedly, they are so good, or the lenses are so good, that the bland background should not be bland, it should be detailed, and it's not. It's not showing any detail at all, it's just showing a sort of grey mass with a few lumps of rock, maybe. So many people have said, well, Stanley Kubrick used it in 2001, he must have had something to do with Apollo because he's using the same technique. No, it's not a good argument, that one. What you have to look at is who was the special effects director that Stanley Kubrick used, who also did the special effects on Blade Runner, Back to the Future. Many of the major special effects that were done at that time were done using models and real studio sets. In Blade Runner, there is a complete city scene, but it's actually a model. And when you see the picture of the model with somebody standing in it, it's quite obvious that it is. Back to the Future was filmed using models, miniature trains to push the car, things like that. Now, who was responsible for the special effects on 2001, Blade Runner, Back to the Future? It was Douglas Trumbull, who was one of the geniuses of special effects. He used models. This is the late 60s, 1970s. Models were what were used at that time. So were models used on Apollo? The answer is yes, they were. It's quite obvious when you know what to look for. But one of the problems with using models is that they have to look convincing, and that perspective has to match what you think you're watching. Many of us have seen the lunar rover. It's called the Grand Prix, where the lunar rover is sort of accelerated up to 12, 15 miles an hour, and it bounces around on the lunar surface. But if you look closely at it, you'll see that the astronaut sitting in it doesn't move. His arm does not move. It's as if it's rigidly contained. That's not the way that any human would work. It's a model we're watching, a radio-controlled model. A very good model, but a model nevertheless. Many of the pictures of astronauts, allegedly on the lunar surface, are of models, of mannequins, because in consecutive photographs, which were taken maybe a minute or so apart, they're in precisely the same position from one photograph to the other. The photograph may frame it differently, but if you look at the mannequin astronaut, they're precisely the same. The arm position is the same, the leg position is the same. It's beautifully done, but they're models.
Man, I'm going to go back and look at this stuff too, because if they're models, that is quite interesting, right? So are you talking about small scale models, like not the astronaut scenes, but all the other photographs, everything are used? They couldn't have been small scale models. Like everything was done to scale, you think, right?
Yeah, it was done to scale, and the set was built to scale as well, because it was a stage set. That's why some of these weird shadow angles appear, because if you're lighting it with electric light from fairly close to the set, you will get strange shadow angles because the light is too close. If it's lit by the sun, the shadows will fall parallel to each other, or they should fall parallel to each other, converging very slightly due to the camera that took the picture. But what we've got are models. They're mannequins. The lunar landers are models. Very good models, but quite a lot of them are taken in the middle distance or the far distance. You can't see very much detail on them. You don't need to see very much detail on them. Some of them are close up, and there's a famous sequence of photographs taken on Apollo 11 as Buzz Aldrin, after whom Buzz Lightyear is named, by the way. As he comes down the ladder, he's photographed by Neil Armstrong, who had got out and done his one small step for man, one giant leap, etc. He'd done all that. Now he got the camera, and he's taking a photograph of Buzz Aldrin coming down the ladder. There's a sequence of 8 photographs showing Buzz Aldrin. You start with his feet coming through the door, then on the top porch, and then 3 photographs coming down the ladder, and he stands in the footpad at the bottom. The first one of him on the top of the ladder, his feet are not touching the rung. Next time you look at that photograph, look at his right foot. It's not touching the rung of the ladder. His left foot is stuck out at a very stupid angle. So ask yourself this question. If you were just climbing down a ladder after clearing the leaves out of the gutter on the top of your garage roof, you're 10 foot off the ground, would you stick your left foot out at a stupid angle when your right foot's not touching the rung of the ladder and hope you're not going to fall off? Because if you do, you're going to break something. But Buzz Aldrin is at the top of this ladder, his left foot stuck out, his right foot not touching the rung, and he's lit up like a Christmas tree. He's beautifully illuminated. Where's all that light coming from? Oh, it's the reflection off the lunar surface. Rubbish! It's not anywhere near bright enough to send that amount of reflected light so that it can be photographed by Kodak Ektachrome film, which is what was being used, and the directly illuminated surface of the moon behind the lander is not overexposed. Kodak Ektachrome film has a very low tolerance of exposure latitude. You've got to get the exposure perfectly right or you ruin the shot. It's a staged photograph taken here on Earth under controlled conditions by professional photographers using fill-in lights. It's not taken on the moon. It couldn't have been. There isn't enough reflected light. Light.